Applied Linguistics Group uploaded this video for BS English students. Dr. KHALID MALIK, the founder, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics. TESOL, has more than 25 research papers. He taught at many foreign universities. Now in a postdoctoral study program abroad. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966 Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at
Prague School and Linguistics.
Prague School was an influential group of literary critics and linguists who came together in Prague with the common desire to create a new approach to linguistics. The most well-known period of the circle is between 1926, its official launch, and the beginning of World War II, the time when Prague offered hope of freedom and democracy for artists and scholars in Central Europe. Their spirit of collective activity, vision of a synthesis of knowledge, and emphasis on a socially defined commitment to scholarship defined and motivated the Prague Circle. Its first president, Vilam Matthijs. They included Russian émigrés such as Roman Jakobson, Nikolai Trubetskoy, and Sergei Karsovsky, as well as the famous Czech literary scholars René Welek and Jan Mukarovsky. Their work constituted a radical departure from the classical structural position of Ferdinand de Saussure. They suggested that their methods of studying the function of speech sounds could be applied both synchronically, to a language as it exists, and diachronically, to a language as it changes. The functionality of elements of language and the importance of its social function were key aspects of its research program. They developed methods of structuralist literary analysis during the years 1928 to 1939. After the war, the circle no longer functioned as a meeting of linguists, but the Prague School continued as a major force in linguistic functionalism, distinct from the Copenhagen School or English linguists, following the work of J. R. Firth and later Michael Halliday. It has had significant continuing influence on linguistics and semiotics. A diverse group of Czech, Russian, Ukrainian, and German scholars in the mid-1920s found themselves together in Prague, Czechoslovakia, the Isles of Freedom and Democracy in Central Europe, Dubrovova 1999. They came together with the common desire to create a new approach to linguistics. Their collaboration was the foundation of the Prague Linguistic Circle. In 1920, Roman Jakobson moved from Moscow to Prague to continue his doctoral studies. There he met Vilam Matthijs and other Czech and Russian linguists, including his colleague, Nikolai Trubetskoy. Also among them was Sergei Karsovsky, a professor of Russian at Geneva University who introduced the work of influential Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure to Prague. These linguists were soon joined by others including Jan Mukarovsky. They decided to establish a discussion group and, on October 26, 1926, following a lecture by Henrik Becker entitled Der Europäische Sprachgeist, the Prague Linguistic Circle held its first official meeting, Dubrovova 1999. Their meetings began irregularly, but soon developed into a consistent schedule of lectures and discussions. Their first public presentations were in 1929 at the First International Congress of Slavicists held in Prague, published in the first volume of the series Travaux du Cercle Linguistique de Prague. Later lectures included presentations by such scholars as Edmund Husserl and Rudolf Carnap. Altogether, the circle members included 8 Czech, 5 Russian, 2 French, and 1 German, with 1 Englishman who was teaching at the University of Brno loosely connected, Dubrovova 1999. The circle concerned itself not only with linguistics but also with aesthetics, literary theory, ethnography, and musicology. In 1935 they began publication of a magazine entitled Le Mot l'art du mot, Word and Art of the Word. The ideal of collective activity, the vision of a synthesis of knowledge, and an emphasis on a socially defined commitment to scholarship which were part of the spirit of the age became the foundation of the Prague Circles program, Toman 1995. Their continued presentations at conferences and publications made it one of the most influential schools of linguistic thought of the 20th century. However, the occupation of Czechoslovakia was almost the death of the circle. Jakobson emigrated to the United States, Trubetskoy died in 1942, and Matthijs died in 1945. The Prague Linguistic Circle represented an important moment in the history of linguistics in that it provided linguistics with new theories such as the theory of linguistic functions. It brought novelty in interpreting language, but it also had shortcomings, for it did not offer a complete and overall theory, which could serve as foundation for further research. The Prague Linguistic Circle started activity in 1928, when, at the First International Congress of Linguistics, organized in The Hague, the Prague participants presented their program drafted by Roman Jakobson in cooperation with Nikolai Sergei Trubetskoy and Sergei Karsovsky. The fruit of their research, Travaux du Cercle Linguistique de Prague, was launched and made known a year later at the First International Congress of Slavicists held in Prague. The first volume of Travaux du Cercle Linguistique de Prague, volume entitled Theses du Cercle Linguistique de Prague, sets out the principles of a new linguistics, structural linguistics. The Prague Linguistic Circle was brilliantly represented by such linguists as Vilém Matthijs, Roman Jakobson, Nikolai Sergei Trubetskoy, Jan Mukarovsky. Their preoccupations covered various areas of the sciences of language. Trubetskoy dealt with phonetics and phonology, Vilém Matthijs dealt with syntax, Roman Jakobson was interested in poetics, and Jan Mukarovsky tackled poetic language. We shall briefly mention just a few of their achievements in the field of linguistics. In 1939, Vilém Matthijs published an important paper entitled On the so-called functional sentence perspective. By theme, Matthijs understood what is known or obvious in the given situation and the point from which the speaker starts in his discourse. Trubetskoy resumed the idea of the paper, referring to Matthijs' conception of functional sentence perspective without covering all the aspects of Matthijs' theory. The basic issue with which they did not agree was the definition of theme. Trubetskoy does not agree with the way in which Matthijs conceives theme. He defines theme as the sentence element that links up directly with the object of thought, proceeds from it, and opens the sentence thereby. N.S. Trubetskoy is another leading representative of the Prague School in that he founded phonological studies. His fundamental conception of the role of sound patterns in language is that they serve to differentiate meaningful units from each other without themselves necessarily being carriers of meaning. In the field of linguistics, the Prague scholars were greatly influenced by Ferdinand de Saussure and by his incipient structuralism. Most linguists agree with the fact that structuralism appeared in 1916, when Ferdinand de Saussure's course in general linguistics was published, and Ferdinand de Saussure is considered to be the father of structuralism. He left a legacy, which greatly influenced linguistics in general, and the first to be influenced by Ferdinand de Saussure were the members of the Prague Linguistic Circle. The linguistic background and the period in which they developed their activity represented a real backup and support for them. Their striving to establish a structural linguistics coincides with the development of linguistics due to the advancement of philosophy. It is the Prague School, by its exceptionally prolific scholar, Roman Jakobson, which is responsible for coining the term structuralism in 1929. In the same year, Jakobson recognized the interdisciplinarity of structuralism. The foundations of Prague linguistic functions were laid by the psychologist Karl Bühler. In elaborating these functions, Bühler started from the idea that language is an instrument. Bühler contributed remarkably to the structural theory of language. He found that the main linguistic functions start from speaker-receiver process of communication. Bühler's conception was accepted by many important linguists of the Prague School. His theory became popular among Prague linguists, however, it was not accepted without being modified and criticized. The first Prague linguist to criticize it was Vilém Matthijs. He made the distinction between the two main functions of language, the communicative function and the expressive function. Matthijs did not consider it necessary to distinguish expressive manifestations from communicative ones. Another Prague linguist who modified Bühler's theory was Jan Mukarovsky. He admitted that Bühler's functional tripartite system applies only in ordinary communication and not in poetic manifestations. He adds a fourth function to the three ones already mentioned by Bühler, namely the aesthetic function. It is not necessary for an aesthetic function to be dominant in a poetic manifestation, it appears as secondary in poetical manifestations. Structuralism conceived language as a synchronic system of signs and the oppositions existing among them. Structuralists believe that the underlying structures which organize units and rules into meaningful systems are generated by the human mind itself, and not by sense perception. As such, the mind is itself a structuring mechanism that looks through units and files them according to rules. Prague structuralism is functionalistic. Functionalism represents approaching and studying language from a functional point of view, from the perspective of the functions performed by it. Prague linguists studied language by strongly emphasizing its functions and the functionality of elements of language. This emphasis on function includes both the function of language in the act of communication and the role of language in society, the function of language in literature and problems of different aspects and levels of language from a functional standpoint. The emphasis on function and functionality makes Prague School different from other structuralist schools. Linguists of the Prague Circle stress the function of elements within language, the contrast of language elements to one another and the total pattern or system formed by these contrasts. The Prague School becomes famous for its interest in the application of functionalism, the study of how elements of a language accomplish cognition, expression, and conation. This combination of structuralism with functionalism is yet another contribution to modern linguistics. The term of function is borrowed from Baudouin de Courtenay and the term of system from Ferdinand de Saussure. In the study of language, the Prague scholars attached a great importance to external factors such as political, social, and geographical ones, and they stress the importance of the social functions of language. The most common definition of language agreed with by most linguists is that language is a universal means of communication. This complex phenomenon was differently dealt with and perceived by linguists. For example, Ferdinand de Saussure conceived language as a social phenomena or system of signs controlled by laws. The way Ferdinand de Saussure conceived language and his dichotomy langue, a social institution, a system of signs, and parole, an individual activity, the product of language, led to the failure of looking at linguistic changes as structural events, with the result that the historical development of language was conceived by him as a sum of isolated deviations originating in parole. Prague linguists deal with the relationship language-speech. They do not agree with Saussure's dichotomy and consider this dichotomy as unnecessary because speech, parole, is the reality of language, langue. Prague linguists approach language from a structural point of view and as part of a system. They define language as functional system of communication means and agree that language performs two functions, of communication and the poetic function. Prague linguists study language from the point of view of its structure. Prague Linguistic Circle signs the birth certificate of a new science, phonology, and Trubetskoy's starting point in dividing phonetics from phonology is the dichotomy language-speech. The Prague linguists distinguish several aspects of language. National language consists of functional styles. Standard language serves as model for a larger speech community. The two basic properties attached by the Prague linguists to the standard language are its flexible stability and intellectualization. In his article O Jesus Basnikum on poetic language, Jan Mukarovsky deals with the problem of language and especially the problem of poetic language. Starting from the definition of poetic language as a component of the system of language, having its own evolution, he conceives it as a functional language. Poetic language exists next to functional languages, any of which represents an adjustment of the system of language to a certain purpose pursued by the discourse. The purpose is to obtain an aesthetic effect. The aesthetic function dominates the poetic language. According to Jan Mukarovsky, a characteristic of poetic language is its dynamism, it being able to reveal the inner structure of the linguistic sign and to find new ways of using it. Poetic language uses the linguistic sign autonomously. Jan Mukarovsky does not agree with the conception of poetic language as a component of literary language. He believes that purists who want to discard foreign elements from literary language conceive it in this way. He believes that poetic language has a close relationship with literary language, which is reflected in its influence over the evolution of literary norm. Poetic language and literary language have independent evolutions and are ruled by independent laws. Another issue that Mukarovsky tackles in his article is the place language has in literature, and he agrees that language is the material which literature uses to obtain literary works. Language acts beyond the limits of literature as the most important system of signs. Language is a phenomenon characterized by changes and which undergoes changes along its evolution. The previous evolution of a language can bring changes within a literary work. A disadvantage of language conceived as artistic material is the fact that the literary work has a restricted circulation and that it addresses to a restricted linguistic community. Poetic language is a component of national language. The permanent transformation of poetic language is the result of the aesthetic function. The evolution of poetic language means the endless transformation of the ways of using linguistic means, which the national language provides it with. Prague Linguistic Circle brought new approaches and new methods in studying language, including the mathematic method. It emphasized two basic terms, the linguistic sign and communication, and contributed to the development of linguistics and of the study of language.